It was a quiet morning in the small neighborhood when the moving truck pulled up to the curb in front of Jake's house. The sun had just started rising, casting a warm orange glow over the neighborhood. Jake had spent weeks carefully packing up his belongings, sorting through old memories, and organizing every single item for the move. Today was the day he was finally leaving. After years of living in the same house, it was time for a change. The constant run-ins with Karen, the HOA president, had worn him down. The endless rules, the complaints, the petty power plays, Jake had had enough. He was moving out, ready to start fresh. As the movers began to unload the boxes from the truck, Jake stood back and watched. He didn't expect any trouble. He had gone through all the proper channels, made sure everything was in order. He had informed the HOA of his decision to move, although he knew Karen would have something to say about it. The last thing he expected was for her to show up. But just as the movers began carrying out his last few boxes, there she was. Karen stormed out of her house, her face twisted in disbelief. She was wearing her usual outfit, a neatly pressed blouse, a pair of slacks, and a look of authority that made everyone in the neighborhood either respect or fear her. As she marched toward the moving truck, her eyes locked on Jake with an intensity that made him uneasy. She didn't waste any time. "What do you think you're doing?" she shouted, her voice sharp and loud. "You can't just leave without my permission." Jake's eyebrows shot up in surprise. He had been expecting some form of resistance from her. But this was something else. "I'm moving out, Karen," Jake said calmly, trying to keep his voice steady. "I've made all the arrangements. Everything's in order." He gestured to the moving truck, where the movers were busy loading the final boxes. Karen didn't even acknowledge his words. Her eyes flicked from the movers to Jake, and she shook her head as if what he said made no sense. "No," she said firmly, her tone cold and demanding. "You can't just leave. You don't get to make decisions like this on your own. You're part of this neighborhood, and I'm the HOA president. You can't just leave without my approval." Jake stared at her for a moment, unsure of how to respond. He had been living here for years, paying his dues, following the rules. But Karen had always found something to complain about, something to control. She had made life difficult for everyone in the neighborhood, including him. He thought this moment would come eventually, but he didn't expect it to escalate so quickly. "I've already handled everything," Jake said, trying to stay calm. "I'm not breaking any rules. I'm allowed to move whenever I choose." Karen's face flushed red with anger. "That doesn't matter," she snapped. "You can't just ignore the rules of the neighborhood. I don't care what your paperwork says. You need my permission to leave. I'm the HOA president." Her voice was rising now, the tension in the air thick. Jake could feel his blood pressure rising as well. This was ridiculous. He had lived here for years without any major problems, and now she was making a mountain out of a molehill. "I'm not going to argue about this, Karen," Jake said, his patience running thin. "I've made my decision. I'm leaving. If you have a problem with it, that's your issue." The movers continued working, but Jake could feel Karen's glare burning into him. She was not going to let this go easily. "You don't get to just walk away from this," Karen said, her voice dripping with authority. "You think you're just going to leave without consequences? I'm calling the police." Jake raised an eyebrow. "The police?" he asked, incredulous. "For what? Moving out? You think you can just disrupt everything without consulting me first?" Karen said, her voice growing louder. "I'll have you arrested for causing a disturbance. I'm calling 911. Jake's stomach dropped as he watched her pull out her phone. "Karen, this is crazy," he said, trying to reason with her. "I'm not breaking the law. I'm just moving out." But Karen was already dialing. Jake couldn't believe what he was hearing. His mind raced as he watched her walk off, muttering into her phone. This was escalating quickly, and he had no idea how to stop it. He had been prepared for some minor complaints, but this was something else entirely. Karen had made her mind up. She wasn't going to let him leave without causing trouble. As she continued talking to the dispatcher, Jake tried to calm down. He had to remember not to lose his temper. But it was hard when Karen was making such a big deal out of something so simple. He stood there, watching her pace back and forth, her phone pressed to her ear. The movers, who had been working quietly up until now, were starting to glance at each other, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. Jake couldn't blame them. He felt uncomfortable himself. The sound of Karen's loud voice carried through the neighborhood, and Jake knew that by now, people were starting to notice. He was sure the entire block could hear her. He had a sinking feeling that this wasn't going to end well. Karen didn't even look back at him as she continued talking to the 911 dispatcher, her words growing more heated. She was exaggerating everything, making it sound like he was causing a violent disruption, when in reality, he was just moving out of his house, minding his own business. Jake felt his stomach twist with anxiety as he realized there was nothing he could do to stop her. He knew the police were going to come, and they were probably going to side with Karen, who had always been the one in control. It wasn't fair. He had followed all the rules, made the necessary arrangements, and yet here she was, trying to turn a simple move into a criminal event. The sound of sirens in the distance made his heart race. He looked at the moving truck, at the boxes still sitting on the driveway, and wondered what the next few minutes would bring. Karen was still on the phone, her face twisted with anger and satisfaction. She was convinced she was in the right, and no matter what Jake said, she wasn't going to back down. Jake had no idea things would escalate so quickly, and now he was left with the sinking feeling that he was about to face something much bigger than just moving out. Karen was still pacing back and forth, her phone glued to her ear, voice rising in volume with each passing second. Jake stood in the driveway, helplessly watching as she spoke to the 911 dispatcher, making the situation worse with every word. His heart sank as he realized just how serious she was about getting the police involved. She wasn't going to let him move out peacefully. This had turned into something far beyond a simple change of address. Yes, hello, Karen's voice echoed in Jake's ears, loud enough for him to hear every word. I have a neighbor who's causing a disturbance. He's moving out without my approval, and I'm afraid this could get violent. Jake's eyes widened in disbelief. Violent? All he was doing was moving his belongings out of his own house. But Karen wasn't letting facts get in the way of her drama. Jake could feel the heat rising in his chest. He had never liked Karen. But this was too much. He was starting to realize that she had a talent for turning the simplest situations into major problems. And now, she was doing it again. His move, which should have been a simple event, had turned into a crisis in her eyes. Karen continued talking to the dispatcher, her words filled with a sense of exaggerated importance. He's disrupting the peace, she said, her voice filled with false concern. I'm the HOA president, and this is an HOA violation. He's making a scene, and I need the police to come and deal with it. Jake shook his head in disbelief. HOA violation? What kind of violation was there for moving out of your own home? But Karen's mind was made up, and there was no convincing her otherwise. She had always thought she had control over the neighborhood, and today, it seemed like she was willing to take things to the extreme to keep that control. It didn't matter that Jake had done everything by the book. Karen was going to paint him as the villain, and nothing was going to stop her. I don't know how long I can handle this, Karen continued, her voice now taking on a dramatic tone. He's threatening the peace of the entire neighborhood. I need someone here immediately to handle this situation before it gets out of hand. Jake could feel his patience wearing thin. He had been prepared for some small confrontation with Karen, but this was something else entirely. It was one thing to have a disagreement about moving out, but it was another for her to call the police on him for doing something that was his legal right. He didn't know how far Karen was willing to go to make him look bad, but he knew it had already gone too far. As Karen continued speaking to the dispatcher, Jake reached for his phone. He needed to keep his cool, but the situation was escalating, and he felt like he had to do something. He dialed his son's number. Hey, it's me, Jake said when his son answered. Karen's called 911. She's making up lies, saying I'm causing a disturbance. There was a brief silence on the other end of the line, and then his son responded. What? She's calling the police? Don't worry. I'll be there in a few minutes. Jake felt a small wave of relief. His son was an FBI agent, and if anyone could calm this situation down, it was him. But he still couldn't believe Karen had escalated things to this level. The dispatcher's voice came through the phone, breaking into Jake's thoughts. "We're sending an officer out now, sir," she said. "Stay inside your house and remain calm. The police will arrive shortly." Jake barely managed to respond with a tight, "Okay." He didn't know what kind of scene Karen was trying to create, but he had to be ready for anything. He watched her as she paced back and forth, her hands moving as she spoke, as if she were painting a picture of a terrible situation. Jake's mind was racing. He had a feeling that no matter what happened, Karen wasn't going to back down without a fight. And as much as he didn't want to get the police involved, it seemed like there was no stopping her now. It wasn't long before Jake heard the sirens in the distance. They grew louder and louder, growing closer by the second. The tension in the air became thick as he could feel the adrenaline building. Karen didn't even look back at him. She was too caught up in her own drama to care what anyone else thought. All Jake could do now was wait. He could already hear the officers talking as they pulled up. They didn't seem to be in a hurry, but they were here. Jake didn't know what to expect next, but as the police car stopped in front of his driveway, the reality of the situation finally hit him. He was about to face a group of strangers who had no idea what had really been going on. And Karen? She was standing there, already preparing her side of the story, ready to make him look like the villain. Jake took a deep breath, knowing that the situation was far from over. He had no idea how the officers would react or whether they would side with him or Karen. But he knew one thing: he wasn't going to let her control the narrative. Not this time. As the police officers stepped out of their car, Jake's heart raced. The whole neighborhood was going to watch. And Jake realized, for the first time, that his move was about to become a spectacle he never could have imagined. But no matter how much Karen tried to control the situation, Jake was going to make sure the truth came out. It wasn't just about moving out anymore. It was about standing up to someone who had gone too far. That Jake's heart was racing as he watched the police car pull up in front of his house. The sirens had gone silent, but the tension in the air felt almost suffocating. He didn't know how this was going to go. His mind was filled with questions. Would the officers believe Karen's version of events? Would they side with her just because she was the HOA president? Jake had done nothing wrong, but he knew Karen's ability to twist the truth. The thought of her winning yet again made him frustrated. He turned his eyes back to Karen, who was still pacing in the driveway, her phone still in her hand. She was talking to the dispatcher, going over the same story for what seemed like the 100th time. Jake could see the anger in her face, her hands shaking slightly as she spoke, but there was something else there, too: confidence. She believed that this time, she would win. She was so sure that she could control this situation, as she had done so many times before with her power in the HOA. What she didn't know was that she wasn't dealing with just anyone today. Karen thought she was in charge, but Jake had something up his sleeve that would change everything. Just as the first police officer stepped out of the car, Jake's phone buzzed. He checked it quickly. His son had sent him a message. "On my way. Don't worry. I've got this." Jake smiled faintly. He had no idea how the conversation with the officers was going to go, but he knew his son would take care of it. The officers began to walk toward him. They looked calm, professional, but Jake could tell they were here for a reason. One of the officers, a tall man with short, dark hair, looked at Jake and then at Karen, who was still talking animatedly to the dispatcher. He cleared his throat and turned to Jake. "Sir, is everything all right here?" he asked in a neutral tone. "Everything's fine," Jake replied, keeping his voice steady. "I'm just moving out. My neighbor, Karen, has some issues with it. She called 911 for no reason." The officer raised an eyebrow. "She called 911 because you're moving?" Jake nodded. "Yes. She's been harassing me for a while now, and today, she decided to make a big deal out of me moving out of my own house. I followed all the rules." "I see," the officer said, his voice flat. He said, turning to Karen. "Is that correct? You called the police about this?" Karen quickly ended her call with the dispatcher and stepped forward, her face flushed with anger. "Yes, that's correct," she said. "This man is causing a disruption. He's moving out without my approval. As the president of the HOA, I have a responsibility to the neighborhood to make sure no one breaks the rules. He is disrupting the peace, and I need the police to handle this situation." The officer listened carefully, his face unreadable. He then glanced at Jake, who was trying his best to remain calm. "So, you're saying he's breaking HOA rules by moving out of his own house?" The officer's question was simple, but it clearly caught Karen off guard. "Well, no," Karen stammered, clearly flustered by the officer's tone. "But he's just making a mess of everything. It's disrupting the neighborhood." Jake took a deep breath, his frustration bubbling up again, but he kept his composure. "There's no mess. I'm just moving my things out. I've been in contact with the HOA, and everything is in order." Karen's face reddened. She was used to having control over every situation, but now, things weren't going according to her plan. The officer turned his attention back to Jake. "Sir, is there anything else going on here? Any reason we need to get involved?" Jake shook his head. "No, nothing at all. Just my neighbor here causing a scene." Just as the officer was about to speak again, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway cut through the tense atmosphere. Jake's heart skipped a beat when he saw his son's car. He knew that, in moments, everything would change. His son stepped out of the car, moving with purpose, his suit crisp, and his face set in a calm but firm expression. The officers didn't seem to recognize him, but they certainly noticed the air of authority around him. Karen, on the other hand, froze. Her eyes widened as she saw Jake's son approach. She blinked, trying to place him, but there was something about him that made her hesitate. He walked straight up to the group, his gaze briefly flicking to Karen, then to the officers. "Good morning, officers," he said smoothly, his tone polite but firm. "I'm Agent Matthews, FBI." The officers looked at each other, and then back at him. Jake's son didn't break eye contact with anyone, his presence commanding respect. Karen's face paled as she tried to figure out what was happening. Jake could see the confusion in her eyes. "FBI?" she asked, her voice shaking. "Yes, Jake's son replied. "I'm Agent Matthews, and I'm here to make sure this situation is handled properly. I understand there's been some confusion, and I'd like to help clear things up." Karen's mouth went dry. She had no idea who this man was, but something about his calm confidence made her nervous. She couldn't understand what was happening. She had called the police to get Jake in trouble, not to find herself face-to-face with an FBI agent. She didn't know it, but Jake's son was about to turn this whole situation upside down. "You," Karen said, her voice shaking, "you can't just barge in here. This is none of your business." Agent Matthews didn't flinch. "Actually, it is my business. This is my father's house, and I'm here to make sure no one causes unnecessary problems." Karen stood speechless, her mind racing. What do you mean?" she stammered, trying to regain her composure. "What are you even doing here?" "I think you're the one who has some explaining to do," Agent Matthews said calmly, his voice not raising an inch. "You've called 911 for a completely baseless claim, and now, I'm here to make sure this situation doesn't escalate any further. You've caused enough of a disturbance." Karen took a step back, suddenly unsure of herself. Her hands shook slightly, and she found herself at a loss for words. She had never expected to face an FBI agent, especially not when she was trying to control the situation. She had always thought she was in charge. But now, she realized, she had made a grave mistake. Jake's son wasn't just a bystander, he was an authority figure, and Karen wasn't prepared for what came next. The air around them grew tense as Karen stared at Jake's son, Agent Matthews, unable to process the situation unfolding before her. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of the calm, assured demeanor he projected. She had spent years commanding respect in this neighborhood, enforcing the rules of the HOA with an iron fist, and now, here was someone who was clearly more powerful than she could have ever imagined. She took a step back, her eyes darting between the FBI agent and Jake. She tried to compose herself, but the feeling of being caught off guard was something she hadn't experienced in years. For the first time in a long while, Karen felt a sense of fear creeping up on her. "You can't just barge in here and demand things," Karen said, her voice trembling slightly, but she was trying to hold on to the authority she once had. "This is a neighborhood issue. You have no right to interfere." Agent Matthews, unfazed by her outburst, took another calm step forward. "Actually, this is my father's house, and I'm here because of your actions. You've called 911, made false accusations, and caused a scene over something that doesn't concern you." His words were measured, yet they carried the weight of someone who was in charge. Jake, standing a few feet away, watched the interaction unfold with a sense of relief. Finally, Karen was being forced to confront the truth of her actions. He had never expected things to go this far, but Karen's need to control and manipulate had pushed the situation to the brink. "I don't know who you think you are," Karen said, her voice rising again, this time with more anger. "But I am the HOA president. I run this neighborhood. You don't get to come in here and tell me what to do. I've been in charge here for years." Agent Matthews didn't flinch, his gaze steady and unwavering. "You're not in charge of anything right now, Karen. You've crossed a line. The neighborhood doesn't work for you, and neither does my family. Your actions are not only disruptive, they're illegal." Jake could see Karen's composure cracking. She had always been the one who controlled situations like this. She'd used her position to intimidate neighbors, enforce arbitrary rules, and make herself feel powerful. But now, standing before an FBI agent, all of that was slipping away. Karen's face turned a deeper shade of red as she tried to regain control of the situation. "You don't get to tell me what's illegal. I've been in charge of this neighborhood for years," she snapped, her eyes wide with frustration. "You have no idea what you're dealing with." "I think you're the one who doesn't understand," Jake's son replied calmly. "Your actions have consequences, Karen. You don't get to just make up rules and expect people to follow them. You've caused enough trouble today. Now, I think it's time you leave." Karen opened her mouth to protest, but her words caught in her throat. She was stunned. She had never been spoken to like this. All her life, she had been able to manipulate situations, bend others to her will, but now, she was standing in front of someone who wasn't intimidated by her. The power she had once wielded was now meaningless. She looked around, hoping someone would come to her defense, but the officers standing nearby were not on her side. They were watching her closely, waiting for her to respond, and their silence was deafening. "I'm calling the shots here," Karen said, but her voice wavered. She could feel her grip on the situation slipping. "I'm the HOA president. People listen to me." Agent Matthews shook his head. "Not anymore. You've made your bed, and now you have to lie in it." Karen's face twitched with anger, but she couldn't bring herself to say anything more. She had pushed too far this time. The officers who had arrived earlier were now exchanging glances, clearly uncomfortable with Karen's behavior. They didn't need to say anything for Karen to know that the tide had turned. The power she had once held over this neighborhood was gone. One of the officers finally spoke up, his voice firm. "We've received enough information to know that this situation has been blown out of proportion. You're not in any position to be making accusations without evidence. We suggest you leave this matter alone." Karen stood there, motionless, her mouth hanging open. She didn't know what to say. She had always thought she could control the situation, that her position in the HOA gave her the right to dictate what others could and couldn't do. But now, faced with an FBI agent and the law, she realized that she had no power here. She had overplayed her hand. "This isn't over," Karen muttered under her breath, more to herself than to anyone else. Her mind raced as she tried to think of a way out, a way to regain some of the control she had lost. But the truth was, she had already lost. Her attempt to control Jake's move, to intimidate him into staying, had failed. She had lost the respect of the neighbors and her position in the HOA. Now, she was just another person caught in a situation she couldn't get out of. "Actually, it is," Jake's son said, his voice cold but final. You've already crossed the line, and now it's time to face the consequences of your actions. You don't control this neighborhood, Karen, and you certainly don't control us. Karen looked at him, then at Jake, and finally at the officers. She realized, in that moment, that there was nothing she could do. She was no longer in control. The officers moved to the side, signaling to Karen that her presence wasn't needed anymore. Jake and his son exchanged a look, and Jake could see the relief in his son's eyes. The tension that had been hanging in the air was finally beginning to lift. Karen, for the first time in a long while, was powerless. With one final, disgusted glance at the group, Karen turned and walked back toward her house, her steps heavy with defeat. Jake stood there, watching her go, knowing that the power she once held over the neighborhood had come to an end. She had made her move, and it had backfired. The situation was over, but for Karen, the consequences were just beginning. The neighborhood had already seen who she truly was, and Jake knew that nothing would ever be the same for her again. The sound of sirens grew louder and louder until they stopped, right outside Jake's house. The tension in the air was thick, almost suffocating. Jake couldn't believe that his simple move had escalated this far. He had expected some resistance from Karen. But this? Calling the police over a move? It was unreal. He glanced over at Karen, who was still standing with her phone pressed to her ear, muttering about disturbances and disruptions, as if Jake was some kind of criminal for doing what was perfectly legal. Jake felt a pang of frustration, but he forced himself to stay calm. The last thing he needed was to get caught up in more drama. As the police car came to a stop, two officers stepped out, their eyes scanning the scene. Jake could tell they weren't sure what to make of the situation. They weren't responding with urgency, just calm curiosity, which only made Karen more frantic. She immediately turned toward them, her eyes wide with exaggerated concern. "Officers!" Karen cried. "This man is causing a disturbance. He's moving out without my approval. I've asked him multiple times to follow HOA rules, but he refuses to cooperate." The officers didn't seem to be buying her story. They glanced at Jake, who was standing with his arms crossed, trying to keep his composure. He wasn't going to get into a shouting match with her. The officers looked back at Karen, clearly weighing the situation. One of the officers said, his tone calm but firm. "We need to know what the issue is here. From what we see, it looks like this is a routine move." "It's not routine," Karen snapped. "You don't understand. He's breaking HOA rules. He's disturbing the peace, and I've asked him to stop several times." Jake shook his head. "Karen, I've told you over and over. This is my house. I've already made the arrangements, and there's nothing illegal going on here." He could feel the heat rising in his chest again, but he kept his voice steady. Karen's eyes flicked back to the officers, hoping they would side with her, but they weren't reacting the way she wanted. The officers exchanged a look, then turned to Jake. "We've been told there's a disturbance, but this doesn't seem like it's worth our time," one officer said. "You're just moving out." Jake nodded. "Yes, that's all. I've followed all the rules, and I've kept the HOA informed. There's no issue here." The officer took out a notebook and started jotting something down. Karen's face twisted with frustration. She had expected the police to take her side, but it was clear now that they weren't going to. Her grip on the situation was slipping fast. "This is ridiculous," she spat. "I'm the HOA president. I make the rules around here. He can't just do whatever he wants." The second officer, a woman with short blonde hair, raised an eyebrow and looked at Jake's son, Agent Matthews, who was still standing nearby, calm and composed. She gave him a questioning look, clearly wondering why an FBI agent was involved in such a simple matter. Agent Matthews took a step forward, his posture confident. "Actually, officer, I think I can clear things up here." He looked at Karen, then back at the officers. "I'm Agent Matthews with the FBI. This is my father's house." The officers stopped what they were doing and gave him their full attention. Karen's eyes widened, and she quickly took a step back, her mouth opening and closing as if she were trying to find the right words. "FBI?" she stammered. glancing between Agent Matthews and the officers. "What's going on here?" You made a false 911 call," Agent Matthews continued, his tone calm but firm. "My father is simply moving out. There's no disturbance, no crime being committed. Your accusations are baseless." Karen's face turned an alarming shade of red as she struggled to compose herself. The officers were no longer focused on her. They were paying attention to Jake's son, who was the real authority here. The moment she had hoped would put Jake in trouble was now backfiring in a big way. She had no idea who she was dealing with. "I don't need to explain myself to you," she said, though her voice shook with uncertainty. "I'm the HOA president, and I have every right to control what happens in this neighborhood." "Not anymore," Jake's son responded. "You've gone too far, Karen. You can't control other people's lives like this, and you certainly can't call the police for something that's not a crime." The officers looked at each other, clearly taking in the situation. The male officer said, turning to Karen, "You don't have grounds for any legal action here. You can't just decide someone's not allowed to leave their home. There's nothing illegal about moving out." Karen opened her mouth, but no words came out. She stood there, her eyes darting between Jake, his son, and the officers. She had spent so many years using her position in the HOA to control people, and now, all that power was slipping through her fingers. She had made a huge mistake by calling 911 over something so trivial, and the officers weren't going to let her get away with it. One of the officers turned back to Jake. "Sir, we're sorry for the trouble. It looks like Karen here was mistaken, and there's no need for us to get involved any further." Jake nodded, relieved but still stunned by how far Karen had taken things. "No problem. I'm just trying to move out without any issues." The female officer gave Karen one last look. I suggest you let this go. If you continue to cause unnecessary trouble, we'll have to take further action." Karen's face twisted in frustration as the officers turned to leave, but they weren't done yet. Before they got back into their car, the officers made one last remark that Karen would never forget. "And Karen," the male officer said, his voice cool, "you might want to reconsider your actions next time. Trying to make a scene over nothing isn't doing you any favors." With that, the police car pulled away, leaving Karen standing in the driveway, red-faced and humiliated. Jake looked over at his son, who gave him a small nod of reassurance. The situation had diffused, but the tension remained. Karen had overplayed her hand, and now, everyone knew what kind of person she really was. For Jake, the victory wasn't just about moving out. It was about standing up to someone who thought they could control everything. The neighborhood had seen Karen's true colors, and it was clear she had lost whatever influence she once had. The air felt thick with tension as Karen stood in the middle of the driveway, her arms crossed tightly across her chest, her mind racing. The police had just left, and so had Jake's son, Agent Matthews, who had handled the situation with calm authority. Karen watched them leave, still processing everything that had just happened. Her heart pounded in her chest, her pride bruised and her control over the neighborhood slipping away with every passing second. She had called 911, thinking she could escalate the situation and regain some of her power, but instead, she had exposed her own desperation. As she stood there, the reality of what she had done began to sink in. She had acted out of anger, out of the need to control everything around her, and it had backfired spectacularly. Jake had stood his ground, and his son, the FBI agent, had completely turned the tables on her. Karen had thought she could use the police to intimidate Jake, but instead, it was her own authority that had been questioned. Her mind was spinning, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she had just lost everything she had worked for. The HOA board, the respect she had once commanded in the neighborhood, it was all slipping away. She had no idea what the future held, but she could feel the grip she had on the neighborhood starting to crumble. As she turned back to her house, she heard the sound of her neighbors talking in hushed voices. She could see them peeking through their windows, their gazes filled with judgment. Karen had spent years making sure everyone knew who was in charge. She had spent years making sure everyone knew to respect her rules, to follow her authority. But now, she was nothing more than the subject of their gossip. The thought stung. It wasn't just the police. It was the entire neighborhood that was turning against her. She had made a fool of herself in front of everyone, and there was no way to fix it. Karen took a deep breath and tried to calm herself. She had dealt with problems before, and she had always found a way to come out on top. But this time, it felt different. This time, the consequences were real, and there was no easy way to escape them. Inside her house, the walls felt like they were closing in on her. She sat down in her living room, staring at the empty space around her. Her mind raced, replaying the events of the day over and over. Why had she let herself get so worked up? Why had she thought calling the police would solve anything? She had always prided herself on being in control, but now she realized that her need for control had pushed her to the brink. She had pushed too hard, and now, it was all falling apart. Her phone buzzed, and Karen quickly picked it up, hoping for some kind of relief. It was a message from one of her HOA board members. "Karen, we need to talk about today. We can't have this kind of disruption in the neighborhood. Your actions are causing problems for everyone." Karen felt a wave of anger wash over her. How dare they question her? She was the president of the HOA. She had always been the one to make the tough decisions, to keep things in line. But now, even the board was turning on her. The text was a slap in the face, a reminder that her authority was gone. She gripped her phone tightly, her knuckles white, as she fought to keep her composure. But the truth was clear. Her time as HOA president was over. She had gone too far, and there was no coming back from it. She had crossed a line, and now, the entire neighborhood was watching her fall. Karen tried to calm herself, but the weight of everything was starting to take its toll. She had spent years building this reputation, years making sure everyone knew who was in charge. But now, in just one day, it had all come crashing down. She was left with nothing but the ruins of her own making. Outside, she could hear the sound of laughter from the neighbors. They were talking, probably about her. And the thought made her stomach turn. She had always been the one who held the power, but now, it was gone. The tables had turned, and it was Jake and his son who held the power now. Karen could feel the walls closing in. She had always thought she could control everything, but now, she realized just how fragile her position really was. The truth was that she had pushed too hard, too fast, and now she was paying the price. As the sun began to set, casting a dim light through the windows of her house, Karen felt a deep sense of loneliness. The neighborhood that she had once ruled was now a place where she no longer had any influence. The people she had once tried to control were now the ones talking behind her back, whispering about her failures. Karen's world, the one she had built so carefully, was slipping through her fingers. The weight of the situation was unbearable. She had tried to control everything, to bend people to her will, but now, she had nothing left. Her reputation was ruined, and her position in the HOA was in jeopardy. She had overplayed her hand, and now she was left with the consequences. Karen sat in silence, staring at the walls of her once proud home. She had no idea what would happen next, but one thing was clear: her life had changed forever. The neighborhood that she had once controlled was now out of her reach. The tables had turned, and Karen had learned the hard way that no amount of power could save her from the consequences of her actions. The lesson was bitter, but it was one she wouldn't forget anytime soon. Karen sat alone in her living room, the soft hum of the evening air conditioning the only sound filling the space. Her mind was spinning with thoughts, regrets, and a growing sense of loss. The world outside her house had changed, but inside, it felt as though everything she had worked for had crumbled in one short afternoon. She had always been the person who made things happen, the one who had the power in the neighborhood. Her voice was law, and her word was final. But now, as she looked around the house, the walls seemed to close in on her. Her reputation, her power, her control, all of it was slipping through her fingers like sand. The events of the day kept replaying in her mind. The call to 911, the arrival of the police, and then the stunning revelation that Jake's son was an FBI agent. She had never imagined this would happen. She had underestimated Jake, thought him just another neighbor to push around, but she had been wrong. His son had not only exposed her actions but had completely diffused the situation. Worse, The whole neighborhood had witnessed it. She could feel the eyes of the community on her, the whispers behind her back. She had gone from the HOA president to just another person who had lost control, another person caught in her own web of lies and manipulation. The realization of it hit her like a wave. The very thing she had feared the most had come true. She had no power left. The people who had once respected her, who had followed her rules without question, were now looking at her with suspicion and disappointment. What had once been a proud community had now become a place where her every move was questioned. Karen picked up her phone and saw the message from the HOA board that she had ignored earlier. With a deep sigh, she opened it. "Karen, we've discussed today's incident. We cannot allow someone who behaves like this to hold a position of power. Your actions have disrupted the community, and we are removing you from your position as president." The words hit her harder than she had expected. She had always thought of the board as a group she could manipulate, but now they were turning against her. She was being stripped of everything she had spent years building. The power she had once enjoyed, the control she had held so tightly, was now gone. For the first time in years, Karen felt truly powerless. She had thought she could control everything: her neighbors, the HOA, the rules, even people's opinions. But now, she realized she had been living in an illusion. The rules she had set, the fear she had instilled in others, had only worked as long as no one challenged her. Jake had been the first to stand up to her, and now she was paying the price. She had been so focused on maintaining her position, so obsessed with control, that she hadn't seen how far she had pushed people away. She had alienated her neighbors, driven them to resent her, and now they were all watching her fall. Her grip on the HOA was gone, and with it, her sense of identity. What was she without the title? Who was she without the power? The thought was terrifying. Karen stood up and walked over to the window, looking out at the quiet neighborhood. The houses were the same, the streets unchanged, but everything felt different now. She felt like an outsider in her own community. She had been the one in charge for so long that she didn't know how to live without it. She had no friends left to turn to, no allies in the HOA. The only person who had stood by her, supporting her decisions no matter how harsh, was now nowhere to be found. She had pushed everyone away. It was a lonely feeling. The thought of facing her neighbors, knowing that they had all seen her fail, made her stomach churn. She had always been the one people came to for answers, for solutions. Now, she was the one who needed help. But there was no one left to help her. The silence in her house felt deafening. Karen had always been the one who made the noise, the one who commanded attention. Now, she was alone with her thoughts, and for the first time, she didn't like what she saw. She had let power get to her head, and now, it had taken everything from her. The phone buzzed again, snapping her out of her thoughts. Another message from the HOA board. She hesitated before opening it, already knowing what it would say. "Karen, we are scheduling a meeting to formally discuss your removal. Please be advised that further actions will be taken if necessary. We are putting the neighborhood's best interests first." The words felt like a punch to the gut. She had been the one to call the shots for so long, and now, she was being kicked to the curb like she didn't matter. She had never thought this day would come. It was supposed to be someone else, someone weaker than her, who lost control. Not her. But now, here she was, alone and broken. A loud knock at the door startled her. Karen took a deep breath and walked toward the door. Was it another neighbor? Someone else coming to make sure she was as isolated as they all thought she should be? She opened the door slowly, not sure what to expect. Standing there was one of her former neighbors, a woman she had never really paid much attention to. The woman gave Karen a polite but firm smile. "I just wanted to make sure you're okay," she said, her tone kind but not without a hint of concern. Karen was taken aback. She wasn't used to this, to anyone checking on her after everything had unfolded. "I don't need your sympathy," Karen replied sharply, but the words didn't come out the way she intended. They sounded weak, tired. The woman's eyes softened. "No one is perfect, Karen. We all make mistakes, but it's how we handle them that defines us." Karen felt a lump form in her throat. This wasn't the response she had expected. She had expected anger, accusations, even gloating. But this was different. The woman wasn't here to take pleasure in her downfall. She was offering understanding, a glimpse of what Karen had once taken for granted, human connection. For a moment, Karen stood there, unsure of what to say. The woman spoke again, her voice quieter now. Maybe this is a chance for a fresh start. Not just for the neighborhood, but for you too. You don't have to be the same person you were. The words hit Karen harder than she could have imagined. The idea of starting over, of changing, seemed so far away, so impossible. But for the first time, it didn't seem like an entirely bad idea. Maybe, just maybe, this was the lesson she needed to learn. She had lost everything, but perhaps it wasn't too late to rebuild. "Thanks," Karen said, her voice barely a whisper. The woman nodded and gave her a small smile before walking away. As Karen closed the door behind her, she felt something shift inside her. A tiny spark of hope, buried beneath the layers of pride and fear. Maybe this was the beginning of something new. Maybe she wasn't done yet.